Welcome to Unit 0, Lecture 1, Time Periods. This Foundations lecture is designed to give you a quick overview of world history before we begin studying individual topics in depth. We will move through major eras, civilizations, and turning points, but you are not expected to memorize every name or date you see today. Instead, use this lecture to build a mental timeline and notice what you already know. We will return to many of these people, places, and developments later in the course. For now, focus on the big picture. What changes from one era to the next, what continues, and where major developments fit in world history. This Foundations unit begins with chronology and then shifts to themes. First, we will move through major periods of world history so you can see the basic sequence of events and developments. After that, we will revisit history through the 6 AP World Themes, often remembered with the acronym SPICE-T: social structures, politics, interactions with the environment, culture, economics, and technology. These themes help us connect societies that may be separated by thousands of miles or hundreds of years. As we work, think about how the same theme can appear differently in different places and times. AP World History takes a thematic approach to the past. Instead of treating every civilization as an isolated story, we ask questions that can travel across regions and time periods. Why do people go to war? Why do states rise and fall? How do societies organize power, belief, trade, or social classes? Throughout the year, we will move beyond simply asking what happened. We will ask why it happened, what changed, what stayed the same, and how one society compares with another. The image in the background, showing Cortez's army in an Aztec illustration, is one reminder that the same event can also be viewed from different perspectives. Historians divide the past into time periods because world history is enormous, and periodization makes it easier to organize. But these boundaries are not absolute. Historians frequently debate where one era begins and another ends. Many dates are approximate, and some periods overlap. Different parts of the world also experienced change at different times, so do not become preoccupied with memorizing every starting and ending date. Use these labels as tools. Your job is to recognize the broad characteristics of an era, understand how it differs from another, and place major developments in a logical chronological sequence. This second timeline continues the overview and brings us toward the periods emphasized in AP World History. As you look across both timeline slides, remember that these labels are organizing tools rather than perfect divisions of the past. Some overlap, and some make more sense for one region than another. The AP course is thematic, but it is still divided into large chronological periods, so you need a basic sense of where events belong. For now, focus on sequence and familiarity. Which of these periods already brings an image or event to mind, and which one feels the least familiar to you? Before we go farther, we need to address Eurocentrism, viewing world history mainly through the experience of Europe. Even familiar period labels can create that problem. Think about the term Middle Ages. Middle between what? That label comes from a European timeline. During centuries sometimes described as decline or stagnation in Europe, other societies were flourishing. Heian Japan and Song China, for example, experienced important cultural and technological developments. The Maya also organized their own history into periods that do not fit neatly into a European sequence. A global history course has to be careful about whose timeline we are using. Avoiding Eurocentrism does not mean Europe is unimportant. It means Europe is one region within a much larger world. The Mongols, for example, transformed the political and economic environment of Eurasia and helped lay foundations for later developments. In the 20th century, countries including India, Egypt, Ghana, and Indonesia joined the non-aligned movement in an effort to resist being defined entirely by Cold War competition between the United States and Soviet Union. As we move through this course, remember that labels such as medieval or modern can be useful, but we should always ask whether they describe the whole world equally well. We begin with prehistory, the period before written records. Historians often use the development of writing around 3500 BCE as a dividing line between prehistory and history. But that boundary raises an important question. Do we spend less time studying earlier humans simply because they left fewer written records? Humans created art, tools, spoken language, and oral traditions long before writing existed. The Kish tablet reminds us why writing matters, but also why historians must use many kinds of evidence. As you move through AP World, remember that the sources available to us shape the stories historians are able to tell. The Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, represents most of the human story. Humans biologically similar to us existed for roughly 130,000 years, while written history covers only about the last 5,500 years. That means written records represent only a small fraction of human existence. Even the period covered by this AP course is tiny by comparison. You are not expected to know the Paleolithic era in great detail, but this perspective matters. Farming, cities, states, and writing are all relatively recent developments. The Venus figurine shown here is one example of the material evidence historians use to study people who lived long before written history. This slide summarizes some of the major characteristics historians associate with people living during the Stone Age. As you look through the list, do not treat these characteristics as a description of one single society. Different human communities lived in different environments and developed different ways of surviving. Instead, use the slide to build a broad picture of life before agriculture and permanent settlement became widespread. Also, notice the stone tools pictured on the right. Material objects like these are especially important because without written records, archaeology becomes one of our best sources for understanding how early humans lived. One of the most important AP World skills is recognizing both change and continuity. Much of the world eventually shifted toward permanent settlements, but nomadic ways of life did not simply disappear. The Bedouin are one example. Originating in the desert region of Syria and spreading throughout the Middle East, Bedouin communities continued traditions of mobility and herding, even as surrounding societies became more settled. We will encounter the Bedouin again when we study the spread of Islam. For now, focus on the larger historical idea. A major transformation can occur while older patterns continue alongside it. The Gadis of northern India give us another example of continuity. They live in a mountainous environment and traditionally herd goats and sheep. Because their animals require different environments during different seasons, many Gadi communities migrate seasonally. It is more accurate to describe them as semi-pastoral rather than constantly nomadic, but that distinction strengthens our main point. Nomadic and semi-nomadic ways of life did not vanish when permanent settlements developed. Historical change is usually uneven, and older patterns can survive for centuries alongside newer social and economic systems. Now zoom back out to the largest possible view. This slide gives us a broad overview of the major periods we will move through in world history. Do not worry about memorizing every label or boundary. Instead, begin asking why historians divide the past in this way. What characteristics seem to connect the civilizations or events within one period? What changes enough that historians decide a new era has begun? Those questions are really about periodization. Throughout AP World, you will need to recognize that historical periods are useful categories, but they are also interpretations created to help us organize an incredibly complicated human past. The Neolithic period marks one of the biggest transformations in human history, the shift toward agriculture and more permanent settlement. The dates on this slide are estimates, often based on methods such as carbon-14 dating, so do not treat them as numbers you must memorize. Focus instead on the development of human societies. People in this era lived much more closely tied to their local environment, and many early structures were connected to worship of gods or spirits associated with the sun, moon, stars, and other natural forces. This growing connection between agriculture, settlement, environment, and belief will appear repeatedly in early civilizations. Permanent settlements brought new characteristics, specialized labor, social classes, complex writing systems, and the construction of monumental architecture dedicated to polytheistic religious practices. We begin our quick survey of ancient civilizations with Mesopotamia, a region that included parts of modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Several important civilizations developed here, including the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires. One major example is Hammurabi's Code, a written set of laws for Babylonian society. You may recognize the phrase, an eye for an eye. Mesopotamian rulers also used religion to support political authority, and some even claimed divine status. As we move through AP World, watch for this recurring connection between political power and religious legitimacy. Mesopotamian civilization also produced important developments in writing, literature, mathematics, and government. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the best-known surviving works of ancient literature. Babylonian mathematics used a base 60 system, and we still see its influence today in 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. The point of this slide is not to memorize every example. Instead, notice how early civilizations created systems for organizing law, belief, knowledge, and political authority that continued to influence later societies. This slide broadens our view to other major ancient civilizations and highlights one development that appears across several of them: writing. Different societies created systems for recording information, preserving ideas, and organizing life. We could spend an entire course on the civilizations represented here, so treat this as an introduction, not a checklist to memorize. We will return to many of these topics later, especially Confucian philosophy and the development of religious traditions that continued for centuries. For now, notice that ancient civilizations in different regions developed their own ways of preserving knowledge and organizing society. Now we shift to pre-Columbian America. These civilizations developed during periods that overlap with what we call the ancient, classical, and Middle Ages elsewhere. It can be tempting to study the Americas on a completely separate timeline, but that can hide important comparisons. The dates do not line up perfectly with Afro-Eurasia, yet early American civilizations shared many broad characteristics with societies in other regions. As you look at the next few slides, think in parallel. What was happening in the Americas while states and civilizations were developing across Africa, Europe, and Asia? As you compare early civilizations in the Americas with those in Afro-Eurasia, look for both similarities and differences. One difference noted here is the use of domesticated animals, which was more limited in the Andes than in many Afro-Eurasian societies. Permanent, sedentary villages also developed later in parts of the Americas. But do not mistake difference for inferiority. Societies adapted to the plants, animals, geography, and resources available to them. In AP World, comparison means explaining how societies developed differently and why, not ranking one civilization as more advanced than another. This slide gives a very quick overview of major pre-Columbian civilizations across three broad regions: North America, Mesoamerica, and South America. Do not try to memorize every name on this slide right now. The goal is geographic orientation. Begin noticing where major societies developed and how widely civilization spread across the Americas before European contact. Later in the course, we will study some of these societies in much greater detail. For now, focus on the big picture. The Americas contained many complex societies with different political systems, economies, cultures, and environmental adaptations. This slide gives us a quick summary of major characteristics of pre-Columbian civilizations. Do not treat the items on the screen as another list you must memorize today. Instead, use them to build a general picture of how complex societies developed in the Americas before European contact. As you read through the characteristics, compare them with what we have already seen in other ancient civilizations. Which patterns seem familiar? Which seem distinctive to the Americas? That kind of comparison will matter much more in AP World than simply being able to recite a list of facts. Classical antiquity marks a period when large empires, long-distance trade, and written records expanded across Afro-Eurasia. Narrative writing became more common. The Silk Roads connected regions from Africa to East Asia, and powerful states relied on large militaries and complex bureaucracies. As you look at this period, focus on scale. Empires ruled diverse populations, moved goods and ideas across long distances, and developed political systems capable of governing huge territories. This slide compares major classical civilizations, such as Rome and Han China. The burial images are especially useful because both show banquet scenes, even though the societies were far apart. That similarity gives us a good AP World question. What can similar evidence tell us about societies that developed independently? Do not assume that similarity means direct contact. Instead, think about how different civilizations could develop comparable social practices, values, or ways of displaying status. Classical civilizations were not completely isolated from one another. The coins on this slide point to Greek influence reaching into the Indian subcontinent and remind us that trade, conquest, and migration connected distant regions. This is an important pattern to notice. Cultural exchange often happens where political and economic networks overlap. As we continue through AP World, watch for examples of societies borrowing, adapting, or blending ideas, rather than developing in total isolation. Classical antiquity also saw the development and spread of major religions and philosophies. As you look at the traditions on this slide, notice that Hinduism is not listed, even though its roots are extremely old. The speaker notes point out that its beginnings are difficult to date precisely, with early texts appearing between roughly 1500 and 1200 BCE. The larger point is that belief systems do not always begin neatly inside one historical period, and many continue across several eras. Before moving into the medieval period, we need to notice the Polynesian migrations. People from Southeast Asia began traveling across enormous stretches of open ocean into the Pacific Islands as early as 1500 BCE. Historians cannot point to one single cause, but environmental pressures or political conflict may have encouraged migration. These communities remained relatively isolated from much of the wider world for centuries, showing how geography can shape both movement and interaction. The term Middle Ages is most often associated with Europe, but this slide reminds us that very different developments were happening across the world at the same time. Europe experienced systems such as feudalism, while China and Japan developed their own political and cultural traditions. The images here show that there was no single universal medieval experience. As we use this period label, keep asking whether it describes every region equally well. This is especially important because the AP World History Modern course begins in this broad medieval period. Europe experienced political fragmentation, while parts of Asia and the Middle East flourished culturally and technologically. The Mongol Empire then overturned existing political systems across much of Eurasia and helped create new states that survived after the Khanates declined. From this point forward, these regional developments become part of the core story of the AP course. The Gunpowder Empires show another recurring AP World pattern: rulers using religion and monumental architecture to strengthen political authority. In several of these empires, rulers governed populations that did not always share their religion or ethnicity. That created a challenge of legitimacy and unity. As you look at the slide, think about the question in the notes. How could religion and grand works of architecture help rulers bring large and diverse populations together? The modern era is often associated with reason, science, technology, and the idea that societies can deliberately improve themselves. Enlightenment thinkers argued that people could shape governments, while market economies emphasized individual economic freedom. But the idea of progress is complicated. As you read the quotations on this slide, ask yourself, progress toward what, and who gets to decide what counts as modern? The 20th century challenged the idea that modernity automatically meant progress. World War II, the Holocaust, and nuclear weapons forced people to ask whether science, technology, and powerful states always made societies better. The notes also point out that ideas of modernity often came from Europe and were sometimes used to judge other societies. So remember, modern is not a neutral label. Historians debate what it means and who gets included. The periods listed here all contribute to what historians commonly call the modern era. Scientific change, capitalism, political revolutions, industrialization, communism, and other developments reshaped how people worked, governed, produced goods, and understood the world. As you look ahead, think about this question. Which of these developments has had the most lasting impact on life today? There's no single correct answer, but you should be able to explain your reasoning. The age of exploration began before Columbus, especially with Portuguese voyages along the west coast of Africa. Still, 1492 is an important turning point because it connected the eastern and western hemispheres more directly. The notes also remind us that many technologies that made these voyages possible came from Asian and Islamic innovations. This period also helped create a truly global marketplace, making it an important step in the history of capitalism. The scientific revolution was a period of renewed interest in observing and explaining the natural world. Thinkers made major advances in astronomy, anatomy, biology, physics, and other fields. The image here shows one of Andreas Vesalius's detailed anatomical drawings. The big idea is not simply that people discovered new facts. It is that observation, experimentation, and evidence became increasingly important tools for understanding how the universe and the human body worked. The scientific revolution also reflected a change in how people thought about human ability. Renaissance humanism had encouraged confidence in individual reason and accomplishment, and scientific thinkers increasingly believed that people could investigate the universe for themselves. New tools and instruments, like Robert Boyle's air pump shown here, made that possible. At the same time, science revealed how much remained unknown. That tension between confidence and uncertainty is part of the modern scientific mindset. This slide introduces capitalism visually through two very different sources, an anti-capitalist poster from 1911 and an image of Adam Smith. Keep that contrast in mind as we move forward. Economic systems are not just sets of rules about buying and selling. People have also debated who benefits from those systems and how much governments should be involved. The next slide will complicate the idea that early capitalism developed completely apart from state power. Early capitalism was closely tied to states and empires. The first joint stock companies were not completely independent businesses. They needed charters from monarchs to operate. When companies faced resistance overseas, governments often used military force to protect commercial interests. The notes point to examples such as Britain in the Opium Wars and the United States in Japan. So while capitalism is often associated with free markets, its early expansion was deeply connected to political and military power. The Enlightenment helped lay the intellectual foundation for the political revolutions of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Thinkers debated government, rights, reason, and the nature of political authority. For AP World, the most important connection is political. Ideas about popular sovereignty and representative government increasingly challenged older systems based on monarchy and inherited privilege. Many governments today contain Republican or Democratic elements that grew from these Enlightenment debates. The Industrial Revolutions transformed production by replacing more hand labor with machines and new sources of energy. This first image of coal pits in England points to one of the foundations of industrialization: access to fuel and the expansion of mechanized production. We will study the process in much more detail later. For now, focus on the scale of change. Industrialization altered how goods were made, where people lived, how they worked, and how societies used energy. Industrialization brought major benefits, but it also created serious costs. It helped produce modern transportation, communication, consumer goods, and improvements in living standards. At the same time, industrial cities often had terrible working and living conditions, and industrial growth contributed to long-term environmental and health problems. The images on this slide capture that contrast. AP World often asks you to analyze both sides of a development, rather than treating change as simply positive or negative. The political revolutions of the late 18th and 19th centuries drew heavily on Enlightenment ideas, but they were led by very different groups. The American Revolution involved wealthy colonial elites, while the Haitian Revolution was led by enslaved people fighting against a slave society. Spanish-American independence movements were also led largely by educated elites. That difference matters. Similar revolutionary language could be used by groups with very different social positions, goals, and experiences. Communism developed in part as a critique of capitalism. Karl Marx argued that owners of capital benefited by keeping workers' wages low, and that this created exploitation and alienation. He predicted that workers would eventually overthrow the capitalist system and take control of the means of production. In the 20th century, leaders in places such as Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and Nicaragua drew on Marxist ideas. Also remember that most economies today are mixed rather than purely capitalist or communist. The Cold War was a global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that usually avoided direct war between the two powers. Instead, competition took the form of a nuclear arms race, proxy wars, espionage, military alliances, and the space race. AP World also emphasizes countries that tried to avoid choosing either side through the non-aligned movement. That global perspective matters. The Cold War affected societies far beyond the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union. The 20th and 21st centuries include enormous global changes, and no single slide can capture all of them. The notes point out that this overview leaves out major topics such as the world wars, genocides, military dictatorships, terrorism, pandemics, and human rights movements. That is intentional. The goal here is not to create a complete list. It is to recognize that modern history is made up of overlapping political, economic, technological, and social developments that we will study in greater depth later. We have now moved from prehistory through the ancient world, classical civilizations, the medieval period, and into the modern era. Use this timeline as a map, not a list to memorize. Your goal is to understand the broad sequence and recognize where major developments belong. As we continue through AP World, you will keep returning to this chronology while adding more detail, comparison, and historical context. This final timeline brings us back to the main purpose of the lecture, seeing the big picture. AP World History covers an enormous amount of time and space, but the course becomes much more manageable when you can place events into a broad chronological framework. You do not need every date in your head today. What matters is knowing what came before, what came after, and how major patterns of change and continuity connect one period to the next.